surgery.
Joining us now to discuss that case, Daniel Hochheiser, criminal defense and civil rights attorney. Dan, thanks for checking in this morning from Newsmax, New York. Two different things at work here, I would imagine. Number one, this civil action contemplated by Melissa Rivers. Number two, possible criminal action. What would be needed for prosecution for wrongful death in this case?
Well, on the civil side, this is really at heart a medical malpractice issue. So what Melissa Rivers' lawyers are going to have to show is that the doctors who performed the surgery on her mother departed from acceptable medical practices, and further that those departures caused Joan Rivers' death.
Dan, this wouldn't be
on the criminal side, I'm sorry, Francesca, on the criminal side, the prosecution is going to be very difficult because Melissa Rivers chose not to have an autopsy performed on Joan Rivers.
Dan, can I ask, would it be an entire center that gets sued in this case, or would it be an individual physician, or what would you say? Or an anesthetologist?
Everybody gets sued. The hospital, the surgeons, anybody working on the surgery, everybody gets sued, everybody gets deposed, they get questioned under oath, and that's how Melissa Rivers is hoping to discover the truth about why her mother's oxygen was cut off during her surgery.
So this is a situation where everybody gets served. You are talking about a laborious process and a quite costly process. In this kind of situation, what might the courts decide? I mean, I think about a really big bill here, even if Melissa Rivers wins her case. Or would those court costs be transferred to the clinic and the doctors if they're found at fault?
I don't think so in this case. I think this case will be what's called a contingency fee matter. Gare Conason is a big plaintiff's firm, and generally in these cases, lawyers take these matters on a contingency fee basis, meaning that the lawyers only get paid if they get a settlement or a judgment in favor of the client at the end of the case.
And mindful of that, the word settlement, the reality of it, despite the tragedy of Joan Rivers' death, but her prominence in show business, would you imagine this thing would get settled in some way, shape, fashion, or form before ever seeing a courtroom?
I don't know about that. I mean, this is going to be a difficult process for Melissa Rivers' attorneys to prove because there was no autopsy done in the case. Given that there was no autopsy, Melissa Rivers unfortunately may never find out exactly what went wrong during her mother's surgery. She may only, at the end of the day, find out that her oxygen was cut off, but she may never discover why because the medical examiner did not have an opportunity to examine the body.
Dan, we also want to talk now, changing gears a little, about the nurse in Maine who has defied her quarantine orders. Do you think she could be prosecuted? Could there be criminal charges here?
No, I don't think so. I just saw that the court in Maine just issued an order isolating the nurse's movements. That was recently, I think, within the hour. So now she is under a court-ordered quarantine. If she violates the court order, then she could be held in contempt of court, and yes, then there could be criminal prosecution. But for the bike ride yesterday that was widely covered, there was no court order, so she has no criminal liability in that situation.
So again, within the hour, there's been the ruling by the Maine court that restricts her movements, essentially says, observe this quarantine. Dan, you have to deal with many issues of a constitutional nature as an attorney. I guess this whole question of public health and personal liberties, there is a balance to be struck. Do you see any way legally that this particular nurse Hickox, could be found, quote, in the right? Does she maintains that she should have the rights, that she's not exhibiting symptoms, or do you come down on the side of, quote, public health?
I think in her case, I come down on the side of public health because although she's asymptomatic, meaning she's not displaying any symptoms of having Ebola, she did treat patients who did have Ebola in West Africa. So I think that the wisest thing to do is what the court has done, and to isolate her until the 20-day period is up to make sure there's no further passing of this deadly disease.
And since you're joining us from Newsmax New York, what about the doctor who is now hospitalized? We understand that when he was interviewed by health officials, he did not tell the truth about his movements, about getting on the subway, about going bowling, about visiting restaurants. Could he face some sort of criminal action in the months ahead?
I don't see criminal liability, but he certainly was perhaps morally at fault. Without some court order or him being placed under oath when he made certain statements, he has no criminal liability that I can see. I think some kind of reckless endangerment of the community would be a real stretch and would be a very difficult case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
Dan, 30 seconds remain. If no criminal liability, professional associations, the Medical Board of New York or other organizations could take ethical action against him, though, correct?
Well, that's true of doctors and also the nurse in Maine because they're licensed by the states. So to the extent that their license is contingent about following certain rules, regulations, government directives, there they could have some regulatory licensing liability which could affect their professional standing.
And we will have to leave it there. Daniel Hochheiser, attorney and member of the bar in good standing, I'm sure. Thank you very much for checking in this morning from Newsmax New York. So you heard what Dan had to say in the case of public health. Something to ponder, something we'll continue to explore. America's Forum will return following this Newsmax Now update.